Welcome to American Black Journal. I'm Stephen Henderson. A new report from the Michigan Civil Rights Commission places much of the blame for the Flint water contamination on a long history of systemic racism in that city. The in-depth report points to segregated housing and education, environmental justice, the state's emergency manager law, and implicit bias as underlying issues that led to the Flint water crisis. The commission says that without a doubt, race was a factor in the tragedy. Meanwhile, it's expected to take until 2019 for all of the city's lead service lines to get replaced. Although the water lead levels are now comparable to other U.S. cities, residents still are using filters because some homes could experience a spike in lead levels during the pipe replacement process. Joining me now to talk more about the commission's findings is Augustin Arblou. He is the executive director of the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. Welcome back to American Black Journal.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I was a little surprised to read this report when it came out, and very heartened to read this report. I feel like race has lurked in the background of the discussion about the Flint water crisis.
Correct.
For a really long time. This puts it front and center and says,
absolutely,
there's not a doubt about this. It's not something to debate. This is something to address. Race played a role in what happened here.
Absolutely. Race is something that has been part of American society for a long time, historically. We cannot deny it. And Flint is an example of that. Its history as one of the most segregated cities is well known, documented, and then its growth as a powerhouse in the automotive sector is also known, and the invitation or the need for African American labor is also well documented. But along with that is also documented a segregated community, a community of have-nots, a community of black and white, a community that was separated by race, wealth, and opportunity.
Yeah, I wrote a column about the Flint water crisis back in, I think, February of 2016 or March of 2016 that talked about the water crisis as the inevitable result of a long series of policy decisions that have been made dating back decades. And a lot of those focused on exactly the things that you're talking about. These decisions that we've made about who will benefit from economic growth, the decisions that we've made about who will live where.
Exactly.
All of these things for years sort of built up to this space where you have this population that's left behind in Flint, is the way I described it.
I'm glad you're talking about that. One of the things that we're really wanted to focus on is the role of implicit bias and the important and critical component of systems, structures, institutions that create racially disparate outcomes.
Yes.
You see that in the area of education, you see it in the area of jobs, you see it in the area of health, and then in quality of life. So what used to be a division within Flint of black and white, then extended and became Flint and Genesee County.
Yes, yes, and one of the things that I can remember discovering that I didn't know as much about and researching that column is the incredible wealth that has grown up in some places outside of Flint.
Correct.
As the city has gotten poorer, which of course race and class go hand in hand in this society very often in terms of maintaining disparities, but in Flint it's really pronounced.
Well, you see it, and you see it in terms of all the studies that come out. And when you talk about Flint, you talk about poverty, you talk about education, and you talk about jobs and opportunities. They're limited in Flint compared to outside of Flint.
Yes.
So what can we do to narrow those gaps? So one of the things that's very important is we have to take a historical perspective. Otherwise, what will happen, Stephen, is we're just going to reproduce the same results.
Right.
And that happens over and over again. And what we're trying to do through the report is really focus our attention on the policymakers, those who can make a change, and have them review it, begin to discuss it, have a dialogue around these important issues that even though we may not have animus, we may not have intent, we still produce certain outcomes where we see primarily people of color, African Americans at the lower end, and others, whites, at the upper end, and that's a reality, and we cannot shy away from it. So we have to think in terms of even the policies and actions that are being taken in Flint. What are the long-term impact? That's what we have to think about. So we have to take a racial equity lens in terms of addressing this issue so they don't repeat themselves again.
So one of the things that happens when someone like yourself steps forward and says, hey, race is one of the factors at play here, is lots of other people say, well, there you go again. You know, that's all in the past.
The race card.
Right. You're playing the race card. You're making this a racial issue by tagging it that way. How do you answer that?
What we answer is, let's sit down and talk about why you think we're pulling out the race card and you think it's not a race card. Let's have that dialogue. We have to have that dialogue because what's happening is we are passing laws that result in disparate racial outcomes. That's a reality. Study after studies after studies show where we're ranking when it comes to jobs, health, housing, education, and so how do we narrow that gap? Yes, those policies may be facially neutral, but over periods of time, Stephen, what do we see? Certain groups end up at the bottom. Do you know there's a book that just came out, The Complacent Class, by Tyler Cowen, a conservative economist from George Mason University. He was rating the 4 most segregated states, and guess where Michigan ended up? Number 4.
Number 4, yeah, I saw that.
And so that's disconcerting.
And we don't think of ourselves that way, I think, here in Michigan. Talk about the need to be able to talk about this and remove the sort of stigma of being called a racist, so-called. I mean, people don't like that, and I think that's a sign of progress, right? Nobody wants to be called a racist anymore. At the
and
same
I believe
time,
they're not.
Right, and at the same time, though, we need to talk about race and its lingering effects, and so it becomes difficult to not get people's backs up when you want to talk about race, but you still have to be honest with them about, look, race still matters.
Well, we made a clear distinction between racist and racism.
Right.
To us, that's very important. The discussion is not about your intent. The discussion, it surrounds the outcomes. What do we do to address that so we avoid situations like Flint from repeating themselves? And what do we do so we can bring communities closer together as opposed to farther apart? The reality is that we have communities that are spatially very segregated. And if we don't have meaningful discussions around that, what is going to be the end result? They're going to remain spatially divided, and what does that do to our education? What does that do to the next generation? Are we going to have a group of haves and then have a community of have-nots? That's what we have to have some honest dialogue. It's not about calling someone a racist, because nobody, I think today, if you were to ask people, do you hate black people? They're going to say, no, they don't hate black people. I think, but when you look at the outcomes, that's really what we're focusing on.
And the things that they're okay with, the things institutionally that they're okay with, that they don't realize have this perpetual effect of uneven outcomes, right?
It's unconscious. It's really unconscious. And the result is that it's not just about saying, well, you have an implicit bias. It's then looking at the results, the studies. All the academic reports out there, all the research that's been out there clearly show it. So, all right, if it shows it, how do we address this? And so our report is really to put that front and center and saying, let's have some meaningful discussions, Stephen. Let's have some meaningful discussions with everybody at the table.
The person I would love to see lead that discussion, of course, is the governor of the state of Michigan. What was his reaction?
I think his reaction was positive. You know, we have a great relationship with the governor, and he's very cognizant of the independence of the commission. It's always difficult to accept reports that may not be most favorable, but he's a great individual. And in that regard, I find working with his office very easy, and we're hopeful that we will create further discussions around this, and I think that we're making some strides internally, working with other sister agencies and state government.
Okay, thanks very much for being
You're
here.
welcome. Thank
Congratulations
you
on
for
the
having me.
report.